I'm just checking the stream here. Stream is up. We are live.
Welcome to the New Jersey Astronomical Association. We are privileged to have with us tonight Dr. Dan Werthimer. Dan is a co-founder and chief scientist of the SETI at Home project and directs other UC Berkeley SETI searches at radio, infrared, and visible wavelengths, including the search for extraterrestrial radio emissions from nearby developed intelligent populations. He is also the principal investigator for the worldwide collaboration for astronomy, signal processing, and electronics research. You can get more information on Dan at our website, NJAA.org. We will be monitoring questions in the YouTube chat box, so be sure to post your questions there. Okay, Dan, over to you.
Thanks for that nice introduction. It's great to talk to you guys tonight. I got interested in astronomy through a club that's similar to yours in San Francisco, and I built a 12-inch refractor out of a reflector out of a porthole in a class from a guy named John Dobson. Can I ask you guys to mute your microphones for? Thanks. So I want to talk to you about this question: are we alone? Is anybody out there? And most of you probably know the field is called SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And there's a kind of theoretical approach to this question called the Drake equation, named after Frank Drake, shown here. And the way the N on the left of this equation is the number of civilizations that we could communicate with in our Milky Way galaxy. Do you guys mind muting your microphones? Oh, we can hear you guys talking. Maybe, I'm not sure if they can. Maybe you can just be silent then, do you mind? Next thing, F sub L, is if you have a good planet with good environment, how often does life get started? And the next thing, I, is for intelligence. If you got a good planet with a good environment and life got started, primitive life, does it evolve? Intelligence, how often does that happen? And the next factor, C, is for communication. Not only do they have intelligence, but how often do they get communication technologies like lasers or radio or some way that we could communicate with them? And the last factor, L, is how long do they live after they develop this technology? Do they blow themselves up with nuclear or chemical or biological weapons? Or do they figure out how to live together? Our sun is about 5 billion years old. It's going to be around another several billion years. Some stars are quite a bit older, 10 billion years. There could be very advanced civilizations out there that may be billions of years ahead of us. So the problem with this equation is that we really don't know any of these factors are. So it's a way to take a big question, are we alone, and break it up into smaller questions, but we know very little about these questions. So really the only way to find out how many civilizations are out there is to go out and look. But I do want to talk a little bit about these factors because we are starting to learn a little bit about the universe. In particular, we know about planets, and we're starting to learn a little bit about how many planets have the right environment. But how often you get life or intelligence or communication, or how long civilization, we really don't know about these last factors. So you can't really use this equation to figure anything out. So I mentioned one of the factors is how many planets are there. And if you'd asked me 25 years ago, are there planets going around other stars? I would say, well, we think so, but we really don't know. It took a long time for astronomers to find planets because they're little dinky things. As you know, 1 million Earths could fit inside the sun. They're right next to these really bright stars. and they don't give off light of their own. So the first planets were found kind of indirectly. What happens when the planet goes around a star, it tugs on the star and the star wiggles a little bit. And you can detect that with the spectrometer. When the star's moving away from you, it gets a little redder. And when the star's moving toward you, it gets a little bluer. And that very slight color shift can betray the presence of a planet that causes the wiggling of a star. And that was done about 25 years ago. This was one of the first stars found to be wiggling. And you can see it has two wiggles. There's kind of a slow wiggle and a fast wiggle. That's due to two different planets, one going around fairly quickly every year or so, and then one further out, maybe like Jupiter or something that goes around every 10 years or so. Then there's the more recent way to find planets is the occultation method. I'm not sure if you can see this, but there's a little artist drawing of a planet getting in front of a star, and it blocks off some of the light. So you can't see the planet like you can in this drawing, but what you can detect with this Kepler spacecraft, which is a big camera, it's a telescope and a camera, a CCD camera, and it takes pictures of 100,000 stars waiting for a planet to go in front of one of those stars. And the light dims a little bit, not by much, maybe a part in 1,000. So it dims a little bit. The reason you have to do it in space is because stars, when the light comes through the atmosphere, as you know, they twinkle a little bit. They get brighter and dimmer. But if you go out in space and you see a dimming star, that's probably because there's a planet getting in front of it. And Kepler found several thousand planets going around their stars, and many of them with multiple planet systems, and some of them in the kind of Goldilocks zone. You know, these planets are too hot, too close to the star. These are too cold. But these things in the green zone, we call it the habitable zone or the Goldilocks zone, are at a place where you could have liquid water. And so we think there are a lot of places for life. And there are probably more planets than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. We estimate about 1 trillion planets, 5 times more planets than there are stars. And maybe a few % of them are habitable planets that have maybe liquid water in the kind of habitable zone. So you might remember the next factor is, okay, you got a good planet, how often do you get life? We really don't know how often that happens, but people have done experiments where they simulate the early chemicals and environments on Earth 4.5 billion years ago in something called the primordial soup. And this was an experiment where you put in, we knew there was methane, ammonia, water, hydrogen around when the Earth was forming. And we also knew there was lightning, so they put sparks in here to simulate the conditions on early Earth. And you don't get gorillas crawling out of this thing, but you do get amino acids, fairly complicated molecules that are basic building blocks of life that make up DNA and RNA. So they haven't made life in this thing, but they've made the kind of building blocks. So we're beginning to understand how you go from simple chemicals to more complicated, eventually self-replicating molecules. The next factor in the Drake equation you might remember is if you get life, you get intelligence. We think that it's likely that there will be evolutionary selection pressure to get some creatures will evolve to become intelligent depending on kind of their ecological environment. That there are other ways to succeed. You can be, run fast or have a hard shell. But one way to succeed is to be smart. And so on Earth, that's happened several times. Intelligence is a convergent evolutionary factor, independent evolutionary things that, octopi are very smart. Dolphins have bigger brains than we do. Chimps have about the same size. And so birds are incredibly smart, crows. So a lot of creatures have become intelligent. My guess is that if we wipe ourselves off the planet, one of these things will kind of take our place in 1 million or 2 million years. So there may even be life in our own solar system, not advanced life, not something like intelligent as humans, but there may be primitive life. A good place to look for it, we think, is a moon going around Jupiter called Europa. And the reason that Europa is interesting is because it's got a liquid ocean. This is a cutaway view. It's got a pretty thick ocean. It's unfortunately covered with this ice, but the ocean is liquid. It's heated by the tidal forces as it goes around Jupiter. and there may be something swimming around there. We're trying to figure out how to drill through the ice and see if there's something down in the ocean. It turns out there's another moon that would make our job easier. So this is a moon going around Saturn, you might know, called Enceladus, and it's got this also liquid ocean, also covered with ice. It's about 20 miles thick ice, but it's got these cracks, these fissures in the ice, and the liquid water has these plumes that squirt out. And NASA and ESA, European Space Agency, are thinking about how you could maybe fly a spacecraft through these plumes and sample what's in there and see if there's something alive in the plumes of Enceladus. That will probably happen in our lifetimes, maybe 20 years away, and maybe a mission to Europa as well. And Europa has cracks in the ice, and maybe some of the liquid water gets out through the cracks. So you might be able to do some kind of surface mission without getting through the 20 or 30 miles thick ice, which is a hard problem. Okay, but I want to talk about intelligent life. And as you know, the field is called SETI. And I wanted to not talk just about my research, but I want to give you a little feeling for other experiments. So Gauss, 200 years ago, the mathematician, suggested that we get in touch with ET by making large geometric structures, maybe a right triangle made out of pine trees, 3, 4, 5 miles on a side, a big square of dirt, a big square of water, a big square of wheat. And ET would look down with their very high resolution telescopes and see that we knew about the Pythagorean theorem, and then they might get in touch with us. It was a great idea, but not funded. Another really cool idea was von Littron, also 200 years ago. He suggested we get in touch with ET by digging a circular ditch 20 miles across, filling the ditch with kerosene, and use this match, not to scale, to light this thing up and make a bright circle of light, a bright ring of fire. And ET would look down and see this bright circle. Unfortunately, it was not funded. Another cool idea was Charles Crow, also a couple hundred years ago. He suggested we get in touch with the Martians by reflecting sunlight with large mirrors to the Martians, and actually several mirrors, one where he lived in Paris and the others to outline the shape. You guys probably recognize it, Ursa Major, Big Dipper. And the Martians would see this bright constellation of bright lights on Earth and perhaps try to get in touch with us. It met with a similar fate. The first funded project in SETI was to send pornography into space. Some of you might recognize this plaque on the Pioneer 10 spacecraft. And this was a very controversial spacecraft because it has a couple of naked people. But on the bottom of the plaque is the solar system. And there's the sun and Mercury, Venus. And here's the Earth with the spacecraft going out into the interstellar medium. And then this is to get an idea of the size of the humans here next to this spacecraft, the Pioneer 10 spacecraft. And these are directions to nearby pulsars, so they can find out exactly where our solar system is. There are little timing marks on here that the pulse periods, so they'll know which pulsars we're talking about, and they can come and eat us if they want. So that was the first funded project to send pornography into space. Now, one of the big ideas in SETI is that Earthlings are sending off a lot of radio and television and radar signals out into space. We don't do that deliberately, but the early television shows like I Love Lucy and Ed Sullivan, they left the Earth 70 years ago, so they travel at the speed of light. They're out 70 light years. They've gone past about 10,000 stars. The nearby stars have seen The Simpsons. This is a plot of television power leaving the Earth, 1940, 1959. And you can see we're getting brighter. This is a log axis, so we're getting brighter exponentially. And so we're brighter than the sun at television frequencies. Pretty easy to detect if ET's within our 70-year bubble of television signals. So maybe if other civilizations are out there, maybe they also have some kind of communication that we could detect, some kind of maybe radio or TV or radar or some navigational beacons, GPS, something that we could detect. Maybe they even sent us a deliberate signal. Maybe they've seen oxygen in our atmosphere, or they've seen our early shows, and they deliberately target us. We've sent deliberate signals out. This is very controversial, whether Earthlings should send deliberate signals. I think it's a risky thing to do. We should just be listening at first. We need to learn more about the universe. We don't know if other civilizations are going to come mine our planet or grind it into dust and get all the gold or something. But so we think it's a good idea to just learn what's out in the universe. We're just a very primitive emerging civilization. We're just beginning to learn that about other civilizations, if they're out there, or how we might communicate. So we don't think it's a good idea to transmit, but nevertheless, people have done that. The idea here is to send pictures. Pictures are probably a good way to communicate. They might not have eyes, but they probably have some way to look at 2 or 3 dimensional images. Maybe it's radar or touch or something like that. And so on this picture, there's a solar system that was, there's the sun there and Mercury and Venus. If Earth is tipped toward the person, here's the DNA molecule. Here's the radio telescope, the Arecibo telescope, the diameter of the telescope, the population of the number of humans, and some amino acids that we're made of, and some binary numbers here. So anyway, you can maybe look for these artifacts out there, if they're out there, accidental signals that might come to us that are sort of products of their technology that really meant for us, or maybe a deliberate signal, which we think if we ever get a deliberate thing, they'll make it anti-cryptographic. They'll make it easy to decode with maybe a lot of information. So I'm not the first guy to think of that. The early radio pioneers, Tesla and Marconi, more than 100 years ago now, thought of looking for radio signals, and they both actually did searches for ET, and they both thought that they found signals from ET. They didn't know it, but they were listening to these things called whistlers, distant lightning bolts. When a lightning bolt goes off a few thousand miles away, the radio waves bounce off the ionosphere, and eventually they get to your thing, but the low frequencies come later. So you hear the low frequencies come, so you hear these whistlers. You hear the high frequency, and then the low frequency later, and so you get this chirping. And they heard that every time a lightning went off, and they thought that maybe was ET. Anyway, at Berkeley, we have about 24 people working on this question. We have a little center called the Berkeley SETI Research Center. They're mostly students that we have astronomy and physics and engineering and computer science students working together. And we have funding from the Breakthrough Foundation, National Science Foundation, NASA. Individual donors help us out. And then we have some companies that donate some of the equipment that we use. And my main motivation is that it's really hard to park on campus, but if you get the Nobel Prize, you can park right in front of the astronomy department. There's a bunch of parking spaces that are reserved for Nobel laureates. So one of the problems in SETI is that we don't know what frequency or wavelength ET might be searching at. So this is a plot down here of the different wavelengths or frequencies, part of the electromagnetic spectrum that get through the atmosphere. So up here, everything's blocked by the atmosphere, but there are lots of windows that astronomers can look through the atmosphere. You don't need to go in space if it's in one of these windows. So for instance, this is the optical window, red, orange, green, blue, yellow. Those colors obviously get through. That's why our eyes evolved to use those colors, because they get through the atmosphere. It's nice to be able to see through the atmosphere. Infrared, there's some windows here. And then a lot of radio frequencies that get through. And we're not sure what ET might be doing. They're using visible wavelengths or infrared wavelengths or radio wavelengths, maybe some wavelengths that don't get through the atmosphere, in which case we're gonna have to look for them in space. So we have different telescopes, these low frequency radio, medium, short frequency radio telescope, short wavelength. And we have some infrared telescopes. I'll show you some of these telescopes that we use, but we're not doing a thorough job. We're just beginning to cover the spectrum. We don't know exactly where to look, and it's a big job to look at all the different wavelengths and frequencies at all the different signal chops. And we're just kind of learning how to do it, getting into the game. So our first search was funded by NASA, and NASA requires acronyms. So SERENDIP is the search for extraterrestrial radio emissions from nearby developed intelligent populations. This was one of the first radio telescopes, or it's a big radio antenna. It's 85 feet across. It's up in Northern California at the Hat Creek Radio Observatory. And while we were using this telescope, this is what happened to it. This is the dish. It now came off this pedestal. So that was the end of that telescope. So then we moved to this telescope in West Virginia. This is even bigger, 300 feet across in Green Bank, West Virginia, in the radio quiet zone. And while we were using this telescope to look for ET, this is what happened to that telescope. So we said, okay, that's the end of the Green Bank telescope. So then we started doing optical SETI, Lick Observatory. Recently, there was a big fire, went right up to the dome where we're looking for laser signals from ET. And we've also been using this telescope, the Arecibo telescope, which until recently was the largest radio telescope in the world. This one is 1,000 feet across. If this mirror doesn't look shiny to you, but radio waves reflect all these aluminum panels, and they come to there's a secondary mirror up here and a tertiary mirror, and then they come to a focus the receivers up here, and then you can move around to cover different parts of the sky. And we use this thing for about 30 years to do searches for ET. And while we're using this telescope, that's what happened to that telescope. This thing, I think I have a little movie of this thing, of the Arecibo collapse. This happened just a few months ago. So this is the structure up above with the receivers. The dish is down here. You can't see it. It's in this valley. And there the cable snapped and brought down this 700-ton. So you might ask, why is this always happening to Dan? Every telescope he uses is collapsing. And the answer, according to the World Weekly News, is that the aliens do not want to be discovered. This is zapped by hostile space aliens. So we've got some new telescopes. We're testing this idea in China at a new telescope and some optical telescopes. The breakthrough LISTEN telescopes we're using at Lick Observatory. We're looking for these laser signals at a telescope called the Automatic Planet Finder. We have a couple of radio telescopes we're using. One is this new telescope in Green Bank that replaced the one that collapsed. It's 100 meters across. It's a really beautiful telescope. And then we have one in the south, a radio telescope called Parkes, which is in Australia, because we don't know if ET is going to be in the northern hemisphere. This would be good for those, or the southern hemisphere. So we're going to look in both places. And we're starting to use a telescope in South Africa. South Africa's got a big desert, and there's nobody that lives there. It's really hot and dry. And that's a good place to build a radio telescope because you want to get away from people and their cell phones and television and FM and get away from all the radio pollution on Earth. So one of the problems that I mentioned is we don't know what frequency ET might be broadcasting on. So you're going to look at lots of channels simultaneously. We build these things called multi-channel spectrum analyzers. And this is a little plot of what comes out. This is a channel number 2,264,191. Here's channel number 2,264,959. And here's a strong channel. There's a strong signal at this frequency. That's the kind of thing that we look for. I wish I could tell you that was ET, but unfortunately it was a satellite, going over the telescope that sends radio waves down into our dish. And we have this problem of radio interference. It's not ET, it's T, it's terrestrial. It's human-made radio pollution or radio frequency interference. But this is kind of like tuning your radio dial across the spectrum, across the dial, and you look at the signal strength meter and it gets strong at some frequency. We're just looking for something strong at some frequency. It's actually better than that. Instead of tuning across the dial one frequency at a time, we can listen to billions of channels simultaneously, so we can speed up the search with these multi-channel analyzers. Another thing we want to do is look for drifting signals. These are things that are signals that are changing in frequency. This one's going down in frequency. This one's going up in frequency. And this one too. And that might happen because transmitters are likely to be on the surface of planets, and planets are spinning around and going around their star. And that introduces a Doppler shift in acceleration. As the transmitters move, they accelerate toward us or away from us, and that can change the frequency. So when we look for these kind of signals, that's a little harder than just looking for a signal that's just staying at a constant frequency. These kind of chirping signals, it takes a little more computing power. These are pretty easy to see with your eye, but we have 100 million of these things to look at every second, a lot of data. And then we also want to look for pulsing signals that are actually hard to see with your eye, but I've circled them here, so they're easy to see. But if I remove these circles and I just ask you to look for a kind of repeating pattern somewhere in this display, it's actually kind of hard to find them. But computers can do it, but it takes a lot of computing power to do that. So the more computing power you have, the more channels you can look at, the more different kinds of signals you can look at. And so we set up this program that some of you may know called SETI at Home, where instead of just using the computers in our building, we asked volunteers around the world to help us analyze the data. So we recorded data from the Arecibo telescope on this. We have a few petabytes of data we stored at the National Energy Supercomputing Center, and we break the data up into little pieces. So everybody gets 100 seconds of data from the Arecibo telescope, a different part of the sky. And then if you want to help us analyze the data, you download the screensaver program. It's called the SETI Home Screensaver. It's a free thing. You install it on your laptop or your desktop or your cell phone. And then you'll be assigned a piece of the sky. When you go out for a cup of coffee, the screensaver pops up. It looks like this when it's running, and it goes through the data that you've been assigned, looking for interesting signals. It reminds you the part of the sky that you've been assigned. This is the right ascension declination, the frequency band that you're looking at. It reminds you what your name is, how much work you've done so far. If it finds an interesting signal, it puts it up here. And when it's all done, it might take a few days. It'll send the results of that analysis back to us, and your name is attached to that data. So if you find the signal from ET, you get the Nobel Prize with me, and you get the parking spot in front of the astronomy building at Berkeley. This is a little animation of the work going out from Berkeley. The yellow dots are the work units, the different parts of the sky going out. That's the blue dots are going out. No, the yellow dots are going out. And then when they're finished, the volunteers are finished analyzing the data. They make a connection on the internet, does this automatically. It sends the data back, and then you get a new piece of the sky to work on. You just keep doing that. So we're taking advantage. This is called volunteer computing or distributed computing or edge resource aggregation. We're just using your spare computing cycles when you're not using your computer. There are about 8 million people that signed up for SETI at Home. It's built one of the biggest computers on the planet. It's made the most sensitive search that's ever been done in ET, looking for radio signals from ET. We're very grateful to the SETI at Home participants. Right now, we're not asking the participants for help, but we're spending most of our time looking through all the data that they've analyzed, looking for the best candidates. But we'll probably turn this thing back on and ask the participants to help us analyze data. Again, although Arecibo is broken, but we're thinking about new telescopes that we could analyze data from. I'll mention that later. Some people don't just use a single computer at their home, but they build these big clusters of computers. They're called SETI farms. And you can go to this website, setifarm.org, and you can see these people posing next to their computers. This guy is posing next to his SETI cluster with bolt cutters. I'm not sure why. Well, we haven't found ET yet, but I'm a little uncomfortable saying, well, we haven't found ET, but we've got a bunch of spin-offs. It's like NASA saying, give us more money because we invented Velcro and Tang or something like that. But that's all we've done so far is we can't claim any evidence of other civilizations. I'm not surprised. I think we're just learning how to do that, but I'm optimistic in the long run. But we have found a bunch of other stuff, and I'll mention some of these spin-offs. So one of the nice things about SETI at Home is it got a lot of kids interested in this question, are we alone? It's a great question because it touches on, kids are interested in this question. It touches on all these different fields of science. You know, how does life get started? That's about chemistry and biology. You can learn about astronomy. You can learn about physics. And so we worked on some curriculum for kids where they address some of these factors in the Drake equation. We also developed some open source software where you can not just use your home computer for doing SETI at home, but now there's about 100 different projects that you can use your computer, and you can pick your favorite projects. Now there's one of the projects is looking for COVID-19 therapeutic drugs. You can look for cancer drugs, malaria drugs. You can do all kinds of astronomy projects, pulsars, planet finding. You can do global warming project. There's a bunch of different things and then you can allocate. You can say, I want 30% of my spare computing cycles for SETI and 50% for gravitational wave research and 20% for COVID-19 drugs. You can pick your favorite projects. SETI at Home, that's global warming. This is gravitational waves. This is looking for primordial black holes. This is the COVID-19 drug therapeutic drug project. We also do some citizen science projects. These are things that are computers are not good at, but human brains and eyes are good at. We sent a spacecraft at our lab called Stardust out to scoop up cometary and interplanetary dust, and we brought it back. This is a sample return mission, and they're little tiny microscopic particles in this aerogel foam that scoop up these particles. And they're really hard to find, but we took millions and millions of photographs with this automated microscope, and then we send the photographs out to the volunteers that they take a little training course how to find the particles, and they run a virtual microscope on their home computer looking for these particles and helping us identify. And they found all kinds of really interesting things that helped us understand how the planets form, how these particles interlock, and they helped us find out what comets and the original, the volunteers found particles that were from 5 billion years ago when the planets were forming, and we couldn't have done it without the Stardust at Home volunteers. So now there's a bunch of these citizen science projects. Another kind of spin-off from SETI was that the instruments that we developed, these multi-channel spectrum analyzers, they do a lot of fancy signal processing, and other astronomers started using them to do all kinds of things. And we helped build a lot of instruments for other things in astronomy. So these originally SETI instruments we adapted to make the first images of the black hole. You might have seen that hit the press a couple of years ago. And now they just made the first map of the magnetic field and polarization around the black hole. That was done on kind of a spin-off from SETI instruments. The fast radio bursts were discovered on SETI instruments, or kind of derivations of the stuff that we originally developed for SETI. Most pulsars have been discovered using instruments that kind of spin-offs from our group. A guy named Matthew Bales found a planet made out of solid diamond using Casper-based instruments, or SETI instruments. They're used a little bit in other things besides astronomy. We wanted to get data out of a brain to control a prosthetic arm. And there's an electrode array with 256 electrodes in the brain, and we used radio links to get that data out. And we used kind of SETI technology to do that. One of our big spin-offs is just we've had a lot of students working with us over the years, and they get trained in all this kind of technology and signal processing and electronics and computing. And some of them started up a self-driving car company, and they made some of that technology now is in the Google self-driving cars. Some of them are astronomers. Aaron is doing cosmology. He's building the big array in South Africa, that trying to learn how the first stars and galaxies formed. Shelley Wright still doing SETI, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her project. Which leads me to future SETI experiments. These are some of the new things we're just starting to work on. This is the FAST telescope in China. It's 500 meters across, even bigger than Arecibo. And we're just starting a big survey there with our colleagues in China, a big SETI sky survey. It'll take 3 years. And we're doing we're kind of doing a raster scan of the sky. And while we're scanning the sky, a whole bunch of other experiments looking for new pulsars, mapping the galaxy, looking for fast radio bursts, and then a couple of SETI experiments all working together, making a map of the sky, scanning the sky together. This telescope doesn't exist yet. This is called the Square Kilometer Array. It's being built in Australia and in South Africa with maybe thousands of dishes. Right now there are 64 dishes in South Africa called Meerkat. It's a prototype, and we're starting to use that for SETI. There's a new thing that we've been working on, this optical SETI. So maybe ET's not sending radio signals, but maybe they're sending us something at visible or infrared signals. And we've been doing this for a while, but we got a new project called PanoSETI, and it's a project with at UC San Diego and Harvard and Berkeley and Caltech. And this doesn't exist yet. This is an artist's conception. But what we want to do is build a telescope that looks out at many places in the sky at once. It's actually made of about 100 telescopes. Each telescope covers 100 square degrees, 10 by 10 square field of view, 10 by 10 degrees field of view. And we put together 100 of them. That gives us about 10,000 square degrees. And so we want to, the idea is kind of look at the whole sky all the time, not just look at one little place on the sky at a time, one star at a time, but try to cover the whole sky. And we have had this kind of thing where you just look at one star at a time, targeted search. This is our search at Lick Observatory. And we've looked at different little stars, but just one at a time. And the problem is that we just look at a millionth of the sky at a time. It's looking through it's a very small field of view, like looking through a soda straw that's 30 feet long. And so you can just see a millionth of the sky. So the problem with that is that if we're looking in one direction, but ET's doing a little flash, maybe once a week or something, we're never going to find them. They're going to be over here. We're going to be looking over there. But so if we want to look for rare signals that are going off maybe once a day or once a week or once a month, we want to be looking everywhere all at the same time. And that is until recently, it's been expensive and hard to do. But there are these new detectors that came from positron emission tomography. It used to cost $1,000 a pixel. Now these things are $5 a pixel. And they're cheap telescopes we make out of Fresnel lenses, these plastic lenses. We're using these 18-inch diameter telescopes, and that lens is $100. It's not very good seeing, but we don't really need very good seeing to detect laser pulses. We don't have to have really, really, really sharp images, so we can use these plastic lenses. So we put together, this is an 8x8 array of these pixels, and then we put 4 of those together to form. Now we've got 1,024 pixels, and we put that back here behind our plastic lens, our Fresnel lens, and now we have 2 of these side by side. We'd like to have 100 of them, but we're just getting started here at Lick Observatory. This is what it looks like now. This is about 2-hour drive south of here, operating at Lick Observatory. And we call it pajama mode. We can run this thing remotely. We're taking a lot of data, learning how to do this, but we're hoping to scale this thing up and build the thing with 100 telescopes. And this will be interesting. It covers this kind of looking for pulses that in an area that nobody's really looked at before, from kind of nanosecond time scales to millisecond time scales. And these are other kind of telescopes here, LSST, and there's some other things that can cover this area, but here's an area that nobody's really looked at before, different time scales. And we don't know, it turns out you can make interesting discoveries in astronomy by just looking at something that nobody's looked at before, looking at a new wavelength or looking at a new time scale or looking at a new place in the sky or a new sort of size range in the sky. We don't understand this, but nature seems to populate the universe. And if in kind of everywhere you look, there's some new phenomena. So we think by just looking at some new thing that nobody's looked at before, we might not find ET, but we might discover something interesting there.
Dan, a question?
I'm optimistic. I think Earthlings would be lucky to find ET. Right now, we're just learning how to do it. We've only had radio 100 years. We've only had lasers 50 years. But I'm optimistic in the long run because we're getting better and better at it in kind of in an exponential way. Telescopes are getting better and better. When I first started, I built a thing that listened to 100 channels. Now we can listen to 100 billion channels. It's not because I'm getting smarter. It's just because we take advantage of the stuff coming out of Silicon Valley. This is computing power.
Dan, a question,
right
please.
Now, computers are as smart as a lizard or guppy, but if this, exponential growth keeps going, they'll be as smart as humans in 10 or 20 or 30 years. That's called the singularity. Be very good for SETI, maybe not so good for humanity, though. So I think if these trends keep going, and there are other civilizations. Oh, I didn't quite want to show
Dan, a question, please.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Going back to those arrays that were made with the plastic lenses, what kind of field of view, what part of the sky, how much of a sky does each of those see?
So each one of those lenses covers a 10 by 10 square degree field of view. Those 1,000 pixels on there, you can't really see the individual pixels, but there's 1,000 little detectors there arranged as a 32 by 32 array of pixels. That's 10 in the focal plane there. That's a 10 degree by 10 degree. That's each telescope can do that. But if we had 100 telescopes, then we could cover 10,000 square degrees.
And yeah, I was going to say, then you said there was the program was to for 1,000 of those telescopes?
We think about 100. We're not, I mean, if you write us a big check, we'll build more, but that's maybe something You
Okay.
know, this one has fewer, this one has more. We might have different domes. If you write us a really big check, we'll put some on in the southern hemisphere, maybe in India or China or something like that, you know, because you can't cover the whole sky from just a single location.
All right. Thank you.
So let's see, just wrapping up, and then I just have a few more slides about kind of where we're going. You know, the trend is looking good. That I maybe not now, but maybe in your lifetimes, Earthlings might find ET. But there may be other ways to do things. This is an idea where you could send a spacecraft to the nearest star and do it quickly. So most spacecraft that Earthlings build, or actually all of them so far, they're really slow. You can go maybe 100,000 miles an hour or something like that, and that would take 100,000 years to get to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri. But this is an idea called Starshot, where you build a sail in space that's 4 meters across, and it's very light. It's a very thin sail, just weighs 1 gram. And then it doesn't have any fuel, but you push it on it with these lasers, a 50 gigawatt laser. It shines on it for 2 minutes. And if you put a 50 gigawatt laser on a sail for 2 minutes, it accelerates at about 20 Gs. It gets up to 20% the speed of light in 2 minutes. And after 2 minutes, it's so far away that you can't really push it with the lasers anymore, but it's going 20% the speed of light. That means it'll get to the nearest star in 20 years. And so that, of course, is just an artist's conception. We haven't built that thing, but people are starting to think about how you could make a very thin 1 gram sail and how you could build a 50 gigawatt laser. But that might be 100 years from now or something like that. Another thing we could do in the long-term future is use the sun as a gravitational lens. We don't know how to do this now, but you know, Einstein figured out that massive objects bend light, and that was shown in light. And soon after Einstein predicted that, we saw that Mercury's light was bent when it got near the sun. And so the sun acts like a lens. It bends light, just like you know, the mirrors and lenses in our telescopes. The problem is the focus is pretty far away. The focus is way out beyond Pluto. But if you could put a camera way out there and point it at the sun, and maybe put your finger in front of the sun or something to block the sunlight, then you could get 10-meter resolution on an extrasolar planet. You know, almost reading license plates. Pretty impressive telescope. That's a telescope the size of the sun. So a couple of my favorite quotes. SETI's the archaeology of the future. Philip Morrison, what he meant by that was that if we ever do get in touch with ET, they're probably going to be far ahead of us. We can't discover radio signals if they're primitive. If they're fish swimming around, we're not going to be able to detect them. But if they have radio lasers, the probability is that they've been around 1 billion years or so. So we could learn kind of what's in our future. How did they get through their bottlenecks? How did they stop killing each other? Carl Sagan said that SETI is profound either way. And what he meant by that was that if we get in touch with ET and get on the galactic internet, we could learn a lot. But also if we do a thorough search, which we can't do now, but if we did a thorough search over the next few decades and we don't find any evidence of other civilizations, that's also profound. It means that life is incredibly precious, and we better take incredibly good care of life on our planet. If you've been asleep, this is a kind of a summary slide. No ET so far. We're still working on it. I just want to end with a couple of slides. The people that participate in SETI at home help us in a lot of ways. Some of them send money that is useful to keep the students employed and they can eat. Some of them help us write the code. It's a big open source software project. Some of them have composed music and literature, and some of them have composed haikus. And there are thousands of people that have sent us haikus, but I'm just going to read you a couple. Paula Cook: searching for life, answers are revealed about ourselves. And last slide, haiku by Dan Seidner: 1 million Earthlings, bounded by optimism, leave their PCs on. Well, thank you very much. And I hope we have time for questions and comments. And feel free to, I guess, Leonard or
Yes.
Jimmy, you're going to try to handle some questions for us?
Yeah, we have a few questions, and one of them was SETI at home, the amount of data that citizen scientists are doing at home versus how much is actually being collected by the professionals. Is it really a significant contribution having all those PCs churning?
Yeah. So what SETI is really good at, what SETI Home is really good at, is doing an extremely thorough and sensitive analysis. So we can't send all the data. If we want to analyze a very large bandwidth, where it's just flowing at many terabits per second, and look at a lot of different wavelengths, that we cannot record and send out over the internet. But the problem with that is that we don't have a powerful computer like SETI at home, but we can do a kind of cursory. So there's kind of two experiments we do. When we're analyzing a wide bandwidth, we just have to kind of do a cursory analysis. We can't look for all kinds of different signal types. We can't look for weak signals. But so we build equipment there. We have computers at the observatory, but we can't record it. But if we want to concentrate on a narrow range of band, maybe a band that we think might be used for interstellar communication, a quiet band, or something we think is interesting, or maybe an interesting place where we might find ET, then we can record the data. And so far we've recorded about 2 petabytes. We can record up to maybe a few gigabits per second. We can, for really interesting things, we can record 100 gigabits per second. Then we can send the data out and have it analyzed, and that's a much more sensitive. So you have your kind of choice of a kind of crappy analysis, but a wide range of wavelengths where you can't record the data. You have to process it at the observatory, or doing a kind of sensitive data analysis using the volunteers, a much more powerful analysis, but you can't record it. So we do both.
Okay. Another question was computer technology today. With the advent of Intel and AMD with all the processors and threads and cores, are computers like that integrated into your environment doing part of the search?
Right. So the SETI at home is one of these embarrassingly parallel problems. Like, you can break it up into lots of cores. And so if you have more cores, or it just goes faster. If you have 16 cores, it goes 16 times faster. And as many, so it's going to be, that's, I think the questioner was smart. They know that that's the way computing, it's not like the clock frequency of your CPU is getting better. It's not, if that's not going to go higher, but more and more cores are getting put on these chips as the technology improves. And that's going to be very good for SETI. We can take advantage of more cores. Not all computing is like that, where you can just sort of break it up into little pieces and take advantage, break it up into, say, you do that and you do that, and all these different computers doing different things. But SETI is easily parallelizable, so we can really take advantage of that. And these graphics processing units that have 3,000 different processors, those are really good at SETI.
Great. We have many people saying thank you very much. They enjoyed your presentation. And the final, not a question, but a comment. It says, glad you mentioned Carl Sagan.
Yeah, I had a chance to work with Carl on SETI. He was really interested in SETI, and he was really interesting to work with. He had really cool ideas. He was a busy guy, so he didn't know, all the details of all of the stuff that we were doing and how it all worked, but he would ask super interesting questions that made us kind of rethink of how we should go about, where we should point our telescope, what frequencies we should look at. An extremely thoughtful guy, and I didn't work with him very closely, but he died too kind of early, at a fairly young age, and I really did enjoy the time that we spent together. And he was he inspired me when I was young. I read books by Carl, before I'd met him, and he helped me get interested in astronomy and SETI and Are We Alone? He was one of the reasons why I got into this.
I just hope that...
I still work a little bit with Carl's wife.
Okay. Maybe someday there'll be the follow-up to Contact, the movie.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
The movie was kind of very close to what we do, except that Jodie Foster found ET, but it was Carl knew a lot about SETI, and he put it in that book.
Yeah. It was a wonderful read. Well, thank you very much for presenting for us tonight. A lot of
Thanks for listening.
yeah, a lot of
Thanks for
information,
good questions too.
and we are very hopeful that in the near future we'll be hearing from your organization that there would be first contact.
But don't hold your breath.
All right, very good. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
All right,
Nice
be
talking
well.
to you. I'm sorry I didn't get to see your faces, but I appreciate your listening.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Take care.
Bye-bye.